Hey, so here's our lemon, my lemon, and I'm going to start with the most saturated color. It's like pure lemon yellow with a bit of water. I'm looking at the area on the lemon that I think is pretty much going to be that color. And remember also that you want to leave, as I'm putting down kind of my most saturated color, you want to leave some room for the lightest color. Now as I do this, again, this is my strongest color. I'm going to go into something a bit weaker. This also, if you remember my talking about this lightest tone also has just a little bit of cadmium in it. So it's a little bit different. Be liberal with the weight of the paper, right? You know, you want to leave yourself a good highlight, maybe room even for a little bit more. Now I'm going to go one step darker, just a duller yellow, while it's still a little wet, and let that kind of combine with the lemon yellow in places. We can go a little bit darker than this. And this, in a sense, is just laying down the basics. You want to get used to doing this, if you can, pretty quickly. The idea is that if you can do this pretty quickly, you can do the rest probably wet on dry. But even doing this much wet on wet, it's going to leave me a little bit of room if I could work fast enough to go back in wet on wet and put even darker darks in. Again, that's a certain kind of choice. If you want to try and work fast enough that everything goes in wet on wet. I'm going to go to a certain point. I want to keep that strong yellow in places, so I don't want to go too far. But I'm going to drop a bit more color. Now I'm going to go a little bit darker back here. And again, I haven't got the best lighting. You want to have some contrast that you can really pick up on. Make it easy for yourself. I have some contrast off of the surface on the bottom here. Now, I can go maybe even a step darker while it's still wet in places that I know, my shadow's strongest. Right about there, maybe here, and then let that dry. So this is a start, just a study. Went in a little bit more with a little bit more dark there. Put down some kind of a shadow, which, on the bottom it's bleeding into some of the darker yellow. That's kind of okay. Breaks up the bottom edge for now. kept some white, strong, yellows in the mid values, the most saturated. I'm gonna need to go darker in some places. At this point, I'm probably best off waiting until this dries a little bit. Just putting in some darker darks as it's a little bit more dry. So essentially I'm painting wet on dry right now. Kind of looking for the strongest shadow areas, deepest shadows. And one of the things that might be really difficult to tell is that until you put this paint for your shadow actually on what you're painting, it's hard to tell if it's too green, too brown, or whatever. As I've said before, I usually do a little bit of edge work with just a wet brush, kind of pushing the paint around. Yellow object, I picked it to do first because it's not easy to do. Probably for doing your first, object of color, it's a pretty tough one actually. I'm picking up a little bit of paint here to maybe catch some of the reflected light. That's still wet enough that I can do that. Remember, reflected light is the light that's reflected off of the surface of whatever the object's sitting on. So that light's coming off of here. Probably it'll be a little bit cooler than any color that you'd see here. So that's some sense of a gradation. Probably could go a little bit darker in some of the darkest areas. Again, yellow is a tough one. Good place to start is probably following that other things. Oranges, grapefruit, stuff like that'll be easier. So for the way I paint, something like this maybe is at a certain point, and I would typically go further. It depends on really how you paint, but if I were to go in more detail, like this lemon is very bumpy, I would start to put in more detail where it was obvious. There's some obvious transition areas, and you could start to really get into the texture. So for some people, going this far, particularly if they're into letting the watercolor do a lot for itself, it can be an end point. For other people, it's a starting point. But even so, however you paint, if you do tend to paint with more detail, or you would go a lot further with something like this, establishing a good sense of light and shadow, a pretty decent gradation to start off with fairly quickly, that can be really important, really crucial to going a lot further. One of the hazards of having kind of a home office situation in your basement is this type of thing right here. This is a spider. I generally don't kill spiders. Spiders are good. He's good. Ooh. But he's quick. So, to continue painting, putting in more detail, I would probably not only go into these lighter areas of the shadow, but also the much darker areas, and so on. Taking a really dark, maybe even punching up the cooler aspect of it, and starting to do the same thing in those darker areas, pulling out kind of that bumpiness, like I said, where it's evident, maybe most evident. And gradually, where it's most evident, you would pull out more texture, more detail, and so on. So let's leave that study where it is. We could do more, definitely, but leave that where it is and go on to the next thing. What's he looking for?